Building a portfolio with Fidelity Basket Portfolios is kind of like making a sandwich. It's as simple as picking your stocks and ETFs, sort of like your meats and other toppings, and managing it as one big, juicy investment. Now that's pretty good. Learn more at fidelity.com/baskets. Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC. Member NYSE SIPC.
Quiet Riot.
Welcome to Quiet Riot. I'm Andreou. For over 2 decades, my very favourite programme on BBC News was Dateline London. It was a panel discussion of the news with foreign journalists who filed their pieces from London. Something about the proximity, combined with the level of detachment, made their views invaluably different from the copy and paste takes generally available. Brexit put an end to this, of course. We'd already had enough of experts, let alone foreign experts. Michael Peel's book, What Everyone Knows About Britain Except the British, offers a similarly refreshing perspective, albeit that of a British journalist who has been reporting from all over the world for 3 decades, mainly for the Financial Times, where he is now science editor. Over the last few weeks, Britain has found itself at risk of splendid trade isolation, hanging from a transatlantic zip wire, waving its Union flags enthusiastic but flabby, trying to decide between leaning towards the EU or the US and doing neither. Too big to be ignored, too small to be anyone's priority. I chatted to Michael about what many Brits think modern Britain's place in the world is, what it actually is, and what it could be if the country could only let go of its paralysing nostalgia.
Quiet Riot.
Welcome to Quiet Riot, Michael.
Hello.
Michael, you've been at the Financial Times an extraordinarily long time by this industry's standards. You describe your first gig, which was covering Michael Portillo losing in the 97 election, which ages us both, I fear. But in that work, you have mainly reported from abroad. And it is in that capacity, really, that you write this book, because you have one foot in Britain and have had one foot in various other regions for a very long time. So I guess it becomes easier to have a bit of distance, a bit of perspective, and to notice the discrepancies at any given moment between what we think of ourselves and what others think of us. We're speaking today at a time when Trump is threatening tariffs, and that's the least of what he's threatening. The UK has left the EU. Starmer is trying to steer this course between the two, where he's saying, I'm refusing to choose between them. So it's a really good time to be assessing what Britain's place in the world actually is. I'm going to start with an unanswerable question. Which way do you think Britain should lean in this?
Well, thanks, Alex, for having me on, and thanks very much for the reminder of my age and the unanswerable question. And the Portillo thing was an amazing start to my career, which was basically because about political expectation. Nobody thought it was going to be a big story, so the rookie reporter got to go. So there was some kind of life lesson there. Thank you very much for the really sort of sharp introduction. I think being outside the country, as you say, there are 2 things that happen. Number one, you got a little bit of sort of distance from events, which can sometimes give you a better perspective on what's going on. And the other thing is you're just outside of the emotional weather a bit, which can also be really quite sort of helpful in perhaps seeing things in a slightly different way, from a slightly different perspective. To your question, where does Britain go now? Well, I think that what's really interesting is that this book came out originally just before the election and has now been fully updated since. And it's a situation now where everything has changed and nothing has changed. That I was writing into the parlous state of, the Conservative administration, which was clearly decaying into collapse after 14 years in power. But Labour has now made this faltering start. It hasn't really sort of grabbed people in the way that certainly as strategists would have hoped. And part of that is still not really knowing how Britain should project itself. It's come out of the EU. Is it that Britain should be independent and bold and trying to sort of summon up these tropes of old greatness? And yet people know that won't work in the modern world, and that, Britain is in an uncomfortable spot. It needs alliances. The US would have been its obvious choice, and now Trump has made that a rather precarious place to be in. And so, again, until the country sort of decides what it is and how it positions itself, we're going to continue, I think, in this kind of slightly anxious half state.
Which was, of course, not only predictable, but actually predicted in the debate pre-referendum. I would say it's not contentious to say that in Brexit, Britain made an economically irrational choice. There are plenty of people who believe in Brexit and who advocated for it that made explicitly the point that the economic hit, as it were, is worth it because of sovereignty and self-determination and other advantages. There are, of course, those who advocated, great sunlit uplands, and I think 10 years later, we can treat those predictions with some skepticism. So why do you think the country made that irrational choice? Is that rooted in a misperception of its size and muscle?
Yeah, I think there were some roots in that, but I would take a step back and say that, this is a book that's about much more than Brexit, right? Or it's supposed to be, but clearly Brexit kind of looms large because it illustrates a lot of pathologies about, why the country is as it is, how it perceives itself versus how it actually is or is perceived by others. I don't come at this as what I would call a sort of doctrinaire Remainer who is sort of romantic about the EU. I was a correspondent in Brussels for some years. I've seen many of the weaknesses of the EU, and they are many.
Yeah, and I'm Greek, so
yeah, right, exactly.
So I think we both don't have particularly romantic notions about the EU.
Yeah, and understandably so. And that's I think a really important point to start off with. And in a way, the problem with the way Brexit was campaigned for is that it illustrated a wider problem in politics today, which is a reluctance to talk about trade-offs and downsides, because it's possible to make a coherent argument for Brexit, which is also honest, which says, as you said in your introduction, well, if we pull us out of the EU, there clearly will be downsides. There'll be sort of economic hits in the short to medium, maybe longer term, and there will be this and that and the other, and we should all be clear that there will be difficulties, but we think that actually the benefits outweigh that. But that was never the offer, was it? The offer was, there are no downsides, this is all going to be great, and so you just need to sign on the dotted line. And that really was why it was sort of corrosive, because it was part of that bigger political culture. And you still see this with Labour sometimes today, a reluctance on something like migration, really, for example, to sort of say, well, yeah, okay, we can reduce immigration levels, but, there are going to be difficulties that are caused by that. And and that was the kind of original sin, really, as far as I was concerned, in how Brexit was presented.
You're right. I think in the epilogue that a problem with British politics that seems glaring from the outside is the way parties often infantilize voters. And it's precisely about a failure to be honest about trade-offs. But you are part of a media environment. I mean, what responsibility does the media bear for this? Because I found it very interesting that before this last election, there was a massive section of the media saying everyone is lying, our finances are in a parlous state. Whoever takes over will have a terrible job of it and will have to probably put up taxes and cut services. And there is a conspiracy of silence. This sort of IFS phrase took hold. But at the same time, every time anyone popped their head above the parapet to make those trade-offs clear, the same media sort of went at them with such gusto. There is no carrot and it's all stick. So is there not a responsibility in the way we report on politics also?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a shared responsibility which goes throughout the system and obviously is in proportion to the power people have, and it includes politicians, it includes the media, it includes think tanks, and ultimately includes voters as well, to engage with the facts on the ground. And you see this, for example, in the interminable debate over what to do about social care, which everyone agrees is a big challenge and is something that needs to be dealt with. And yet whenever one party or another comes up with a plan, often people on the other side, for political advantage, have torn it down. You remember Theresa May in the 2017 election and so on. And this is a real problem. And I think it is infantilization in the sense that, every day of our lives, most of us are dealing with trade-offs of one sort or another, right? We're making judgments on things we buy, things we do, and upsides and downsides. So what's really needed, and I don't think this is unique to Britain, but I think you do see this in other European countries as well, but it's a kind of moment of political clarity just to say our politics is sort of based on this nostalgic idea that we can go back to the days of prosperity, Western industrial and political dominance after the Second World War, and les 30 glorieuses, the 30 glorious years, as it put evocatively in French. Those days are gone. They're never coming back. Whether consider that state of affairs to be desirable or not, it is gone. It was a unique moment in time. Our society is much older, and that means a very different way of structuring the economy and funding for services and so on. And the world has changed. There are new powers who are oppressed by colonialism or their own internal conflicts or both. And now they're on the up. They're big and they're becoming dominant forces in big sections of the world economy. And I don't feel that any politician in Britain, or perhaps not much in wider Europe in mainstream politics, has sort of made those arguments as honestly as they need to be made. I think people kind of intuit them, right? We know from our own family circumstances, older relatives and so on, that we are aging as a society, but there isn't that sort of full acknowledgement that this is something we need to deal with and it will require some tricky decisions.
Yeah, and yet I think that elegantly rather ducks the question, which is that you know, and I know, that the first politician to honestly articulate what he just said, their career would end.
Well, I mean, you may be right. And it's obviously a very difficult speech to give. It's a very difficult subject to address. But there have been moments of clarity in British politics in the past. If you think, for example, of Conservative Prime Minister Harold Macmillan's Winds of Change speech when the British Empire was collapsing. And he basically said, look, we might not like this as British imperialists, but it's a fact. And so we just have to deal with what's happening. And in a way, it's that level of saying, look, there are big forces at work here that we have to adapt to. And I think they're forces that people see are real from their own experiences.
Especially right now, especially in this moment.
Yes.
I think what this moment has actually revealed to anyone but the most blind is that we are in the middle of some quite big tectonic plate shifts.
Yes, I think so. And that's why, you can understand, on one sense, Labour's softly approach with Trump. But on the other hand, if that sort of shades into a sort of sense that, well, this is just business as usual, people are going to realize that this is nonsense. And there has to be a way of sort of threading that needle and sort of, while observing the requirements of diplomacy, at the same time acknowledging that it does introduce an extra level of instability, which a country like Britain, which is no longer in its regional grouping, has to work extra hard to deal with. And again, that kind of acknowledgement isn't quite there at the moment.
Do you think that Britain's imperial past, fairly recent imperial past, does it skew modern notions of how Brits see themselves in the world, and is that helpful? Because there is an argument that one of the prerequisites for punching above your weight is to believe that you can do that, to sort of occupy your position in the G7, let's say, unapologetically. So I don't put it out there as an entirely, horrible negative thing, but as a foreigner, when I saw that part of the argument for Brexit was this phrase, Global Britain 2.0, I did find myself asking, what was Global Britain 1.0? Was that a good thing for the world?
The question of post-imperial nostalgia, it varies, and obviously Britain itself is changing. The Britain of today is very different from the Britain the 1960s, not least in that there are many people whose heritage is in countries that were formerly occupied by Britain who are British in 2025. And so it's a situation that's always evolving. But I think it's fairly clear that empire has had, the legacy of it has had some kind of grip and a certain sort of nostalgic influence on politics for a while. And you see that in the way that scholars and artists or so on who tackled empire and its legacy in recent years. There's been quite a sort of ferocious backlash in some quarters against this, when quite often these writers or artists are merely stating facts and not necessarily coming up with radical reinterpretations, but just sort of laying out things that happened and events that are not really contested in any substantive way. So yes, there's definitely that post-imperial nostalgia, perhaps expressed in a less offensive way as, Britain is, a great country that punches above its weight. And I think you're right that kind of sort of self-confidence and presence can be helpful in some ways. And as a Singapore senior diplomat who I interviewed in the book pointed out that this is one of the things that Britain to some extent sacrificed with Brexit, that it had this outside voice in international diplomacy.
Is this Chan Heng-chi?
Chan Heng-chi, yes, exactly.
It's a really good interview in the book.
Thank you. And speaking to Chan, she was really interesting because obviously Singapore is a country that economically has done incredibly well, and yet it is a small country in a big region with other powerful states, and it knows that it has to make alliances to survive.
Yeah, so, it is the fairy tale of punching above your weight,
but also of how essential alliances are to navigating a world where you just have much bigger neighbours. And Chan made the point that partly because of the colonial legacy of the English language being so widespread, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations uses English as an official language of communication because, it become this lingua franca of international diplomacy. And to some extent, Britain sacrificed some of that in the EU. Moving to Brussels, it shouldn't have been a surprise, but it was sort of striking how much business was conducted in English, communal business, because of course, it's by far the most popular second language of people from many of the member states and so on. I think where it becomes more difficult is when you get, and I talk about this in the book, situations like Britain trying to exert itself as a global military power still by sending aircraft carriers, which have a rather sort of sorry mechanical record so far, into the South China Sea to do exercises there. Perhaps the world's most contested waters politically. And there you get a situation where the UK is not the US. It's a much more vulnerable potential target to China or any other country because it doesn't have the firepower that Washington does. These carriers, the UK doesn't have enough support ships or even aircraft sometimes to make a full convoy, and therefore it's reliant on allies or leased planes to make up the numbers. At least it has been historically. And so there you get to a situation of, well, if global Britain means trying to overextend oneself militarily in regions far away from home and therefore creating potential security vulnerabilities, is that a smart way of going about it?
Yeah.
And it will be interesting to see how Labour handles that.
We're kind of seeing that in the Chagos Islands debate, which is currently raging on. We see those decisions that should be practical, right? Those are decisions that should be pragmatic above anything else and strategic above anything else. And yet it's divided entirely along partisan lines, and you get people just genuinely trying to make this the next Falklands, rending their garments, people who would struggle to put a pin on a map within 10,000 miles of the Chagos Islands 6 months ago, because it's British territory, because those last vestiges of empire, I guess, have an emotional value. So how do you overcome that emotional attachment to the accoutrements of the past? You describe in the book, you're watching the coronation from Tokyo, and you're cognitive fracturing because you're seeing something that assumes Britain in that moment is the center of the world, but you're in a place that's going about its business.
Exactly. And that is a good description of why the Chagos Islands case has become so symbolic. And of course, the framing is Britain is giving something away, whereas, of course, what's not acknowledged is, well, the only reason it is, quote, giving this away is that it occupied this place in the first place.
At some point, yeah.
That's less talked about. And perhaps paradoxically, the weaker the metropole becomes, the stronger that kind of backlash will be, because stuff is being done from a position of vulnerability, not from a position of strength. And of course, you've got the added aspect of the Diego Garcia air base as well, and the US interest in that, and that adds to the stakes as well. But in the end, it's something that over time, I would suggest just has to happen. I mean, the British Indian Ocean Territory is a historical fiction born of empire, and that has to change. And then sure, you can debate over what the details of that change should be. And of course, one of the extra difficulties here, which we haven't touched on, is the fact that islanders who were forcibly evicted by the British, many of them are complaining that they haven't been consulted on this change, and it hasn't made clear, what their futures might be, including possible future pathways back to live in the area. So, there's a lot that still needs to be hashed out there, and it just shows how complicated these post-imperial legacies are to make right and make good in the modern age.
Quiet Riot.
Now, this is an advertisement for BetterHelp Therapy Online, who are sponsoring today's episode. Thank you to them, and here's a little more about their service. When it comes to relationships, we hear a lot about the so-called red flags we should beware. But have you considered that there may be green flags as well? It's a positive take on a very serious subject. The idea that we should be looking for specific signs that a relationship will be loving. But what signs should we seek? If you're unsure, therapy can help you identify green flags, actively focus on them in your relationships, and, just as importantly, embody that green flag energy yourself. Whether you're dating, married, building a friendship, or just working on being your best self, it's important to form relationships that love you back. This is where therapy can come in. It can be helpful for learning positive coping skills. It can teach you about setting personal boundaries, and it can empower you to be the best version of yourself. Therapy, then, isn't only something that's of benefit to those who have experienced major trauma. It can be incredibly useful in helping us navigate the day-to-day challenges that life throws at us, including those interpersonal challenges that can prove so tricky to navigate. With over 5,000 therapists in the UK already, BetterHelp can provide access to mental health professionals with a diverse variety of expertise in mental health. Discover your relationship green flags with BetterHelp. Our listeners get 10% off their first month at betterhelp.com/quietriot. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/quietriot.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only. Then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Quiet Riot.
I'm very keen on your view of Great British Energy, because there is actually a really key chapter in the book about how Britain sort of frittered away its natural resources, in a sense. You look how Norway, for instance, has gone about keeping that as a state asset, as opposed to what Britain did, and it is rarely talked about. And I see a lot of echoes of that in what's going on now. Actually, I see again and again that notion that we must keep a stake in the stuff that we develop in the future, that the state cannot just provide the subsidies and allow private companies to just cream all the profit. So how do you think that aspect of this Labour government is doing?
Yeah, it's interesting that you cite that chapter, Alex, because quite a lot of people have said that they found that chapter particularly interesting. And I think it is revealing, as you say, that especially in discussions of the Thatcher era, that North Sea oil is relatively little mentioned in British politics. And the fact that Britain had this enormous resource, which if it had done what the Norwegians and other countries did, which set up a sovereign wealth fund, that could be worth hundreds of billions of pounds now. It could be absolutely massive, and you can use it in various ways. You can use it just to generate financial returns and grow over the years, or you can use it to invest in infrastructure, or bits of both. And how valuable would that be to meet some of the country's needs in areas from key public infrastructure requirements to social care requirements and so on?
Yeah.
Labour obviously is trying to look at this a bit more strategically. And one of the other points that I make in the book is how Britain, having been an island nation, for long that was an advantage. It was a defence against invasion, not least in the Second World War. But now it's kind of switched, and suddenly it's become a bit of a disadvantage in an era where trade is being wielded as a weapon, and suddenly being on a small island with not many resources and no land links to your neighbours suddenly looks more like a problem than a safeguard. And so Labour, with its creation of institutions like Great British Energy, like the new Wealth Fund and so on, is clearly trying to look at things in a little bit more of a strategic way. I mean, how significant those will be in terms of the amount of money that is going to go into them is one question that people seem to have, and that's still not fully clear. And of course, in energy in particular, there's a whole other piece about regulation of markets and pricing and so on, which is absolutely huge. And any kind of coherent energy policy has to get into that as well. But it's welcome, I think, that there is at least a sense that Labour is trying to look at this in a more strategic way. But again, it's something that probably needs to be aired in public a bit more about how reliant Britain is on many resources, from certain food imports to key metals which are used in the technology of the Green Revolution, and stuff that it just doesn't really have access to itself. And I think there's a strong case that Labour should get that out there more, not to alarm people, but just to be honest with people and say, well, look, these are the challenges that we will need to deal with.
My difficulty is that the problem being described is emotional, and the solution to it can't be reason. That's the thing really at the center of this. You interviewed historian David Edgerton in the book, and he said something that struck me, that modern British history is written from a very narrow perspective. Like a deliberately narrow perspective, and there is something in that. So to me, a lot of this stuff seems like, if you were addressing the psychology of an individual, you would say it's a psychological defense, it's denial. There are very unpleasant things that we don't want to look at. There are things that we are proud of, that we do hold on to. The solution to that can't just be give people the facts. It needs some kind of emotional anchor to pivot to a different way of seeing the country.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And that's the job of politics. And I've never been one of these people. I find this a very strange view that politics is a rational business. There are probably two types of people who vote emotionally and people who vote emotionally but don't admit that they vote emotionally. And, I think it's a great sin of many educated people who look down and say, oh, well, look at these less educated people who just, vote on their whims and emotions, whereas I use rationality to cast my vote.
Yeah. Whereas my whims and emotions are much more advanced.
Exactly. The only difference is perhaps they're just less intellectually honest to themselves. But so, yes, this all needs to be in an emotional and inspiring political framing. But I think that can be done. What you do is you say, look, times have changed, and that's just what happens. The country is existing in a different world now. But as I say in the book, we still have a lot of advantages in this country, and we need to make the most of them. And that means being kind of sensible and hard-headed and saying, look, there are certain things that Britain might have done 50 years ago, whether it's to do with the political power it had then, or to do with industries that it had a stake in, which are either disappeared or gone elsewhere now, that we're not going to do those anymore, and that doesn't make any sense. But let's stick at what we have an enduring strength at or newly developing strengths at, and max out on those and recognize that we're a smaller country in a bigger world, that we need to build alliances. Obviously the relationship with the EU is a part of that, but also there's a broader question of how, Britain fits into the wider framework of the world. And here are the challenges we face, but we can meet them. And the first step towards meeting them is to be open about what they are, and then we will decide what to do, and we will do it. There's a kind of inspirational tone that you can take with that, which is not about doom and gloom at all, but the very opposite, I would say.
So what you're saying, and again, I found the fact that having surveyed the ruins of Britain's reputation, I found it really smart and actually quite heartwarming that you ended up in a place of positivity in the book. So what you're saying, I guess, is that it's not about just letting go of the past. It's about getting people to subscribe to a better future.
I think so. I mean, isn't that how we all operate in our own lives? There's something in the past we regret for whatever reason, and one of the best ways to move on from that is to have something to look forward to, right? A positive vision of what we can move on to, and if we're lucky, people in our lives who can help us to do that. The same goes in politics and mobilizing people behind a goal. And I don't mean in a kind of, Soviet kind of 10-year plan kind of thing. But again, I do think that there's a general sort of sin in politics of underestimating people's intelligence and people's ability and willingness to grapple with, complex, sometimes contradictory points and trade-offs that might be uncomfortable, but in which they can see, well, there might be a short-term cost to something, but if it's explained clearly to me that there's a plausible long-term goal that I approve of, you know what, I might still be willing to back this. And again, these are decisions we make on a micro level in our own lives all the time about things that we do. So why shouldn't we be capable of making those collectively for areas that the national good? And I think that people probably are realizing more and more with the destabilizing influence of global conflict, the reemergence of Trump, that this idea of the world as a kind of basically benign place, if you're sitting in a country like Britain, where, if you had a certain level of income, it was in the 1990s, when I was growing up at that time, things seemed relatively tranquil. Well, we're not in that world anymore. And the difference perhaps is that whereas if you were poor in Britain, you were always suffering, struggling. Now, even if you're not poor, you still have a sense of that unease and the difficulties that we face both nationally and in terms of the instability of the wider world.
So to circle back to the beginning and link it to this more optimistic tone, I know that Britain finds itself in a precarious position at the moment because, like I said, the tectonic plates are shifting. There are big blocks preparing for trade aggression, and we're a little bit unmoored in the middle. But do you think in that danger there is also an opportunity? Is there a way to box clever and actually carve ourselves a very good position out of this general conflict?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are ways of handling it smartly, absolutely. And, number one thing not to do will be to try and sort of play the US off against the EU. I can see Britain getting itself, itself badly burned if it does that. And, broadly, I mean, it's a kind of platitude, but, Labour must be correct that, it does need to have good relations with both the EU and the US. And what this is a sort of dose of realism that it's going to be difficult to have reliable partnerships with the US, certainly for the next 4 years or so, because policy can change very quickly. And of course, there's not to say the US of the past was not capable of and ruthlessness in its political decision making, but clearly the current administration, at least at the moment, is on a trajectory of moving very quickly and suddenly in directions that are quite destabilizing to some things that Britain is quite committed to in international cooperation. So certainly there's a need to just adapt to that and to handle that as best as can be handled, and meanwhile to continue to try to improve relations on the European side. And of course, the issue that Labour, I think, is going to have to deal with at some point is that given how the idea of GDP growth is so central to the government's policies, that clearly doing things like joining the customs union and the single market would potentially boost that quite quickly. But those are things that have been ruled out. And I wonder if as the years go by, whether that might become something that sort of forces its way onto the agenda, if only that it might be difficult for the government to generate the growth that it needs through other means.
Michael Peel, thank you very much for your time and your honesty and your putting up with my rambling.
Oh, Alex, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure, and likewise, exactly the same. Thank you for having me on.
Quiet Riot.
I hope you enjoyed that. The updated edition of Michael's book, What Everyone Knows About Britain Except the British, is out this week on paperback. You can buy it in our bookshop at uk.bookshop.org/shop/Quiet Riot. You will be helping us and a local bookshop. If you enjoy our work, you can also support our work on ko-fi.com/Quiet Riot Pod. And if you can't afford to, you can rate, review us, and spread the word. Ko-fi supporters will get a chance to win a signed copy of Michael's book. Details of how to enter will be on our Discord channel soon. I have been mulling that conversation in my head, and the conclusion is inescapable. The nostalgia from which Britain suffers, I should say actually in my view mainly England suffers, and that lack of honesty in our politics that Michael talked about are not merely symptoms of the same dysfunction. I think one flows from the other. The reason politicians are dishonest about trade-offs is because to an inflated national ego, the very idea of having to make trade-offs is an affront. The reason the right-wing press leaps on every scrap of realism with shouts of "stop talking Britain down" is the misguided notion that a country's position is some sort of unknown quantity that can be talked up. We are a society with large parts of it permanently stuck in "do you know who I am" mode, and that needs to change. But talking therapy takes time. Perhaps Trump will be the more drastic shock treatment that finally snaps Britannia out of it. We shall meet again for Sunday School. Until then.
Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads, with Naomi Smith, Alex Andreou and Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sangeeta, artwork by Simona Canelu. Quiet Riot is a co-production with Soundstone Global.
Quiet Riot.
Working hard is worth it if you're seeing results. And when it comes to working out, the same thing is true. You want the maximum benefit in the time you have. And that's exactly what Tonal is built for. And with their latest iteration, Tonal 2, you can ensure your workout is more tailored and effective than ever. Tonal's at-home strength training system uses adaptive weight to learn from your movement and set the optimal weight for every move, adjusting in 1-pound increments up to 250 pounds, challenging even the most advanced users to push their limits. You can also experience a full body burn with the new Aero HIIT workouts, the perfect blend of heart-pumping cardio and strength. Plus, the new built-in Smart View leverages a high-resolution camera that lets you see yourself during your workout, analyzes your movement, and provides real-time coaching, just like a personal trainer. Right now, Tonal is offering our listeners $200 off your Tonal purchase with promo code 200TONAL. That's Tonal.com and use promo code 200TONAL for $200 off your purchase. That's Tonal.com. Promo code 200TONAL for $200 off.